minutes, but I don't think we don't have minutes, so I'll just give it a few more seconds. I think we'll have people trickle in, and I hope you've grabbed a coffee or a bite to eat, and thank you and welcome to part 2 or take 2 of Learning Through Stories, a conversation about Indigenous evaluation practices. My name is Rebecca Gokert, and I am the director of the Evaluation Capacity Network that is hosting this conversation. We also hosted the first conversation on May 18th, so you would have had access to the pre-recorded video for that. I'm a professor in the School of Public Health at the University of Alberta, and I want to welcome you today to our Lunch and Learn session. And thank you for taking time out of your day, and also to our guests for the next hour. So please know that we're recording. You probably got that little announcement through Zoom, and we will make it available on our YouTube channel after the fact so that you can go back and take a peek at that, and also for those that weren't able to join us today. And we will send a link out after the session. Just in terms of housekeeping, we have a number of participants joining us. They'll be trickling in as we go through. So in order to make sure that our technology runs smoothly, we have disabled microphones and cameras. If you want to turn your camera on, you're welcome to do that. But it just enhances our connectivity. We're going to spotlight Larry and Melissa today during the conversation, so you shouldn't make any adjustments or shouldn't have to make any adjustments to your screen. And we also have a support team in the background, so hold tight if you have any unexpected interruptions or we're dealing with any technological issues. We will try to manage that as quickly as we can. So we will just advance to the next slide. So the purpose of our session today is to engage in dialogue about decolonizing and Indigenous approaches to evaluation. And this has been an area of real great interest to our network members and to our key team members as well. And we've invited you here today to join us in a follow-up conversation with an open heart and an open mind. So we have a number of students that work with us. I've asked Kirsty Keys, who is one of our doctoral students, to open up our session today and share some of her experiences and learning in this space. So I'll just pass it over to you, Kirsty.
Thanks, Rebecca. Hello, good morning, everyone. If you weren't able to attend or watch the first webinar, my name is Kirsty Keys. I am of Mi'kmaq and settler heritage, and I'm a proud member of Glooscap First Nation in Mi'kmaq territory in Nova Scotia. I've lived on Amiskwaciwâskahikan, Edmonton, Alberta in Treaty 6 territory all my life. And here I've been a student member of the ECN for 3 years. I'm also a PhD candidate at the University of Alberta, studying school and clinical child psychology with a dissertation focus on community-based research, studying Cree parenting in the early years. This week, ahead of the land acknowledgement today, I've been reflecting on what it means to be on this land. Many people who've lived with and trusted this land are currently facing hardship due to the wildfires where I live in Alberta. Other areas across Canada and North America are facing similar threats alongside dry conditions, air quality concerns from smoke and pollution, and other climate change consequences. I've been taught from books written with elders and from teachings I've had from a knowledge keeper that for several Indigenous groups in Alberta, the 4 quadrants of the medicine wheel can be used to represent 4 peoples, each with their own gift and responsibility from the Creator. As noted in writings by Dr. Leona Makokis, who is an elder from Kahiwan First Nation, Indigenous peoples are represented by red and were given the gift of spirituality and the responsibility of being stewards of the land, including being in a reciprocal relationship with all parts and beings of the land. Reciprocity in relationships is a concept that's taken on a whole new meaning to me thanks to the many Indigenous teachers I've spoken with and read. Reciprocity with the land and with the Indigenous peoples who have been taking care of it since time immemorial. So today, as I acknowledge the land I'm on, I want to thank and honor the many Indigenous peoples who have been caring for it, many of whom are still fighting to ensure we take care of our land. I want to acknowledge the Cree, Blackfoot, Dene, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe, Inuit, and Mi'kmaq people. And I'm looking forward today to more discussions on how we can use evaluation in a good way in reciprocal relationships with Indigenous peoples and the land to benefit all of those involved.
Thank you, Kirsty. So we'll just advance to the next slide. So the reason that many of you are here today, you may know about the Evaluation Capacity Network if you attended the last session, but for those of you who do not, I'm just going to take a brief moment before I introduce our guests. And the ECN, it's an interdisciplinary and intersectoral network, and we're housed within the Community University Partnership for the Study of Children, Youth, and Families in the School of Public Health at the University of Alberta. We support individuals and organizations across our municipality, our province, and nationally with research and evaluation. The requests that we get range everywhere from needing the support of a graduate student, help building an evaluation framework, building evaluation capacity within an organization, or taking on the evaluation of a large initiative, and all kinds of things in between. So today's session is a continuation of a conversation we started with Dr. Melissa Tremblay and Larry Bremner on May 18th. And we want to continue to bring attention to and discuss Indigenous approaches to evaluation. We're seeing that a lot more within the work that the ECN is doing. And certainly, as I mentioned, our ECN members and network members are quite interested in continuing dialogue in this space. So I'm really pleased to welcome Dr. Melissa Tremblay and Larry Bremner to engage us in a dialogue and help us critically reflect on our own work in this area. So I'll start by introducing Larry Bremner. He's worked in social research and evaluation for 45 years. Larry is recognized for his expertise and willingness to share his knowledge, particularly in the areas of Indigenous and decolonizing approaches to evaluation, and the inclusion of people such as children and youth whose voices are habitually overlooked and undervalued. Larry is a former president of the Canadian Evaluation Society, where he represents CES on the international stage, where he was the driving force behind the creation of the Global Eval Partners Network, Eval Indigenous. In 2017, Larry received the CES Service Award, and in 2018, the Contribution to Evaluation in Canada Award. In 2019, he was inducted as a Fellow of the Canadian Evaluation Society, the Society's highest honor. Larry is also co-editor of the new permanent section of the Canadian Journal of Program Evaluation, Roots and Relations, Celebrating Good Medicine in Indigenous Evaluation. And I encourage you to take a peek at that section. It's an open access journal. So moving to Dr. Melissa Tremblay. She is a member of the Métis Nation of Alberta, born and raised in rural Alberta. Melissa is an assistant professor in the School and Clinical Child Psychology program at the University of Alberta. She's a registered psychologist and an Indigenous liaison with the Canada FASD Research Network. Melissa has worked in the field of evaluation for over 10 years and maintains a private evaluation practice. Melissa's research takes a relational, community-based participatory approach and has allowed her the privilege of working in partnership with Indigenous peoples, communities, schools, and agencies across the country. In 2019, Melissa received the inaugural MyTax Award for Outstanding Innovation Indigenous, and more recently, she received the Community-Based Research Canada Emerging Community-Based Researcher Award. Her work maintains a strong focus on advocating for transformative, community-grounded approaches to supporting Indigenous children, youth, and families to access their strengths and wisdom. So we are in very good hands today with Melissa and Larry. So as I mentioned, Larry and Melissa have already shared their experiences with us on May 18th, so we're not going to repeat that presentation. You all had access to that pre-recorded video, and that was your homework. If you hadn't had a chance, we're going to pop that in the chat later for you if you want to view that at a later time, just so you've got access to it. But during that time, we did have a wonderful discussion. We ran short of time, of course, and there was still a number of remaining and lingering questions. So I've got those in my back pocket. So we want to really spend our time together today to continue answering the questions that were posed during that past session, but invite you to ask questions, engage in dialogue, add comments within the chat box, or maybe even share additional resources that you've been leaning into in your work. So all the questions for our speakers can be shared in the chat box throughout the session, and I will pose them directly to our two panelists. So please don't hang on to your questions. We're monitoring the chat. We can manage that ourselves. And let's get started. So I don't know if we've got questions yet, and if not, I have a whole schwack of them. So maybe I will just get started. So I am going to, maybe I'll pose this first to Larry. This was a question that was raised last time. Are there cultural protocols for sharing stories that evaluators should consider?
Definitely. As a story listener, you have a number of responsibilities, I believe. You have from my perspective, you have a responsibility to share pieces of yourself, of your story. If you're sitting there expecting other people to share pieces of their lives with you, I think the protocols will vary depending on community and depending on the context in which the evaluation's taken place. But we have, actually, I'll do a little plug. At the Canadian Evaluation Society National Conference next week, we're doing a session on storytelling, and we have outlined a number of things you should do before, during, and after, and your responsibility in terms of a story listener, in terms of making sure that you're in a comfortable space with the person, that you're relaxed, that the person knows exactly why you're there, who's going to be shared with, that in fact you're going to mask their name and context so they can't be identified. You have a responsibility to make sure that the stories are heard. And I mean, I could go on, but yeah, there are protocols, and there are, I think, major responsibilities. As I said, if you're a story listener, you have, I think, an ongoing responsibility to the person who is telling you the story in terms of protection. And from my perspective, also to advocate to make sure that that story is heard and understood. Melissa.
Yeah, I completely agree with all of what you've mentioned, Larry. And I was having a conversation just yesterday, actually, with some students of mine about how they had collected some qualitative information from participants, but wish that they could go back and collect more demographic information. And we had a really good conversation about why we collect the information that we do. So often as researchers or even as evaluators, we approach the collection of information in a really extractive way, right? And we don't even think about why it is that we're asking for that information. And so I completely agree that we need to be clear about how it's relevant, what we're going to do with that information, especially if we're collecting stories, that we have a responsibility to hold those stories with deep integrity and ensure that we're preserving the meaning of those stories and the intention with which they were relayed to us in the first place. So I think those are important considerations as well.
I also think that underlying the whole notion is if the story can't, if the story doesn't address a community priority or community well-being or improvement in the community, then you shouldn't be there having the story told to you. This isn't for the interest of funders or program people in a different context. The work we do in Indigenous communities should be driven by the community, for the community, and provide information that the community can act on. And if that isn't being addressed, then we have no business being in the community, quite frankly, I think.
That's actually a really nice segue to a question, Larry, that somebody asked. What advice would you have for allies that are working in this space for responding to and supporting Indigenous evaluation? So I think you gave a nice, piece about, like, if it isn't being community responsive and it is not identifying what's relevant to that community. But I'm wondering for those evaluators that are working in this space, that consider them allies in this space, how can they sort of, be responsive in that way? Do you have any ideas about that?
Based on my experience, I've had the good fortune to have worked with an ally, and this individual, by being an ally, she has inroads into boardrooms and meeting rooms that I and colleagues of mine do not have. So as an ally, this person plays, I believe, a very, very important role in terms of raising awareness of what Indigenous evaluation is and why it is important. And being an ally, this person can bring that message to people I don't have access to. So that person, from my perspective, is playing a really important role for Indigenous evaluation and almost education in terms of high level decision makers who I would not have a chance to talk to. I don't know if that answered the question, but I really believe allies can play a very, very important role in helping spread the word and the importance of Indigenous evaluation.
Thank you, Larry. Melissa, I don't know if you wanted to add to that. I have kind of a follow-up question to that.
Sure, why don't you go ahead with your follow-up?
Sure. It's related to the question that just came into the chat and a previous question. I'm going to kind of add them together. So the question in the chat is, how ready do you think funders are for more cultural forms or culturally responsive evaluation? That's kind of part one. And then the second part to that question gets into reporting. What does it mean to decolonize evaluation reporting? And I put reporting because that's tied to sort of that funding. It's, how ready are we in this space to actually think about different forms of evaluation, and not even different forms, but culturally responsive?
Yeah. So I've been thinking about that word responsive a lot recently. And I wonder if the term culturally responsive, we can even unpack that a little bit. So it sort of implies that as an evaluator, I'm kind of going forward on my path, and then I will respond to community needs as they come up, which is different from a culturally grounded or community driven kind of approach, where whoever I'm working with in community is actually setting the stage and defining the metrics and the purpose. So it sort of shifts things a little bit if we can think about even moving beyond culturally responsive evaluation to culturally driven or community driven evaluation. That's one thing that I was thinking about. So, and the reason I was thinking about that is because in the chat, this question, how ready funders are for cultural forms of evaluation. In my experience, it differs depending on the funder, but in general, I think funders are more ready or open to those culturally responsive forms of evaluation where we kind of stick to much of what conventional forms of evaluation are, but maybe we're responding in incremental ways to community needs, or community is involved in different ways in the evaluation. Whereas I think funders are less open to completely culturally driven or community driven approaches to evaluation that really flip things on its head. So things like not submitting your traditional scientific looking report as an evaluator. I think funders are less open to those kinds of things, but I don't know what you would add to that, Larry, but
Actually, I agree with you. I've been thinking about this lately and been having chats about it in terms of, we talk about participatory evaluation and cultural responsive evaluation. And I think, and it goes to what you're saying, I believe things won't change. The frame right now is, okay, we're going to have a participatory approach. So let's approach these people in this community and get them to participate. Or culturally responsive, okay, we'll respond, let's get people in this community. And I think the frame has to change so that it's the community that's saying, you know, we're going to have a participatory approach here, and we'll approach the funders, we'll do the approaching as opposed to being the ones on the receiving end. I really agree with you in terms of culturally responsive. It should be culturally driven and it should be community driven. In terms of funding, and I might have said this in the last session, I can't remember, but I still see the problem is that funders are still funding in silos. And if we're talking about working in community and looking at community priorities, and we look at the relationality, we can't just fund an education program. It has to be more holistic in terms of development so that you have education and you have some social service programs and you have health and nutrition and you have justice or whatever. And instead of just funding a justice program or funding an education program, it would be so nice if funders came together and looked at it from a holistic point of view, as opposed to, this is a symptom, we'll just fund this program and get that. And so I think while funders are starting to understand that the language has changed, I don't think the way they fund has really changed as much yet.
Is there hope?
Is there hope? I think there's hope. I mean, there's, and I think of the federal government and in 2015 when they finally signed UNDRIP and said, in Canada now, we're going to work with First Nations, Inuit, Métis, and they're going to be a priority. And I think, but the problem is you have a number of government departments that are looking at reconciliation and doing particular things, but there's no cross-pollination in a way, or there's no, so that you've got, I think, a lot of important initiatives, but there's no kind of integration so that, again, it becomes a sort of holistic approach to evaluation and to funding,
Yeah, I agree. Amanda has another question, and maybe you can speak from your experience, or if you have an example you could share. Her question is around funders' openness or readiness for, receiving different forms of, evidence, I guess, and how do we define that? So artwork, ceremony, oral storytelling as evaluation and sharing back what was learned. And again, do you have examples from your own work where, you have used these different, maybe it's arts-based approaches, Indigenous approaches to data collection and sharing, whether it's sharing back with a funder, like that's kind of one thing, but what did you find worked in those different contexts?
So, so I've always argued that one of the responsibilities of an evaluator is to educate the client. And so what we have done over the years is we have done a number of case studies I'll use an example. When I was working up in Nunavut and we were looking at prior learning assessment and for the college up there, and we wanted to do case studies, and they weren't really sure what those were. And so we went into communities and interviewed people, had them tell their stories, why this had been important to them, what it meant to their lives. We talked to community members about the adult learners. We talked to the educators in the colleges and put those stories together. And those became the funder, which was a federal government funder. When we presented the final report, came up to me and said, it's the stories that tell the story of the program, not the statistics, right? And so it's really important, I think, and I'll use an example. A good friend, colleague of mine, Dr. Nikki Bowman, she and I are co-editors of Roots and Relations, Celebrating Good Medicine and Indigenous Evaluation. Nikki and I have worked, and Nikki pushed the journal so that the University of Toronto Press and their lawyers have agreed that any Indigenous submitters to Roots and Relations own their work. There is no longer given ownership to the publisher, right? And so people are starting to understand that knowledge has been taken from communities for years, and at some point people are pushing back saying, it's our knowledge, we own it, and we're not giving it up anymore, right? And so that's another example of sort of how we're trying to decolonize the journal. In terms of methods, we have used arts-based methods for years, and the clients have been willing to accept it as a piece of the overall evaluation, right? And then once they see the importance of what we can get out of either stories or arts-based, they understand that there's more to this picture than pre-test, post-test, or whatever, right? So I think there's an acceptance, but I also think it's a responsibility on our part to try things to show them that there's more than focus groups and surveys,
Yeah, I would completely agree. Some other examples, I guess, from my own work that have worked really well in sharing back information might be things like photo books or photo exhibits. So having people, whether staff or participants or whoever, take pictures that sort of represent their experiences, and either having quotes that accompany those or superimposing quotes over pictures, and having photo exhibits to not just display that, but also generate conversations among people about what these things mean and implications for the program or the community. Other ways of sharing knowledge from evaluations that have been really important in the work that I do is sharing back information in really informal ways with the people that I'm working with on an ongoing basis. So we're always generating ideas together about what information means and how that can be shared meaningfully. I think as evaluators, we're always responsible for knowing the different audiences that who we're sharing back information with, and the language or the currency that they use. And I don't see a lot of shifts in terms of funders being open to different ways of sharing back information that replace more traditional methods of, your 50-page report or whatever it might be. But I see new, not necessarily new, but different unconventional kind of less academic ways of sharing back information as being in addition to. So as evaluators, as you've already mentioned, Larry, I think we're responsible to reporting back or integrating learnings with community or with clients in ways that mean something to them. It doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to be what the funder expects from us. So it may be both, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I'll give a quick example. We evaluated the youth gang prevention program, and for the report, we did a number of different things, but in this one instance where we did in-depth case studies on one particular project, we asked the person who was the coordinator to read the report. And in fact, he read the report and had a section of his reflections on the report and on the project itself. And that was in the final report. And so I think it's really important. I was just in meetings a couple of weeks ago saying, like, if you're going to do this, you've got to get into the communities. You have to go to the communities because that's already been identified as a priority. But they also have to validate what you're doing. They have to be a meaningful part of it. And at the end of the exercise, you have to go back and go through the data analysis and the report and get them to, in fact, validate that authentically reflects what they were thinking they were telling you. Because if it doesn't, then it's just another wasted exercise. Okay.
Yeah, it's connected to the question that just came in. When you don't have that opportunity, and we know in funding cycles where organizations are applying for funding or there's a reporting requirement that, not that it springs on you, but it's like, oh, we're now at the end and we need to wrap this up. And the question is, when you don't have that opportunity for prolonged engagement, but you are being asked, by Indigenous communities, organizations, to support them in writing up those evaluation or an evaluation plan. And it might be in order to get funding. It might be, once the funding's wrapped up, and this particular individual is curious as an outsider and a settler. So what kind of what advice would you have for this individual as an outsider settler, but is being asked, being approached, right, and wants to support organizations, even from a methodological perspective, what about that kind of inability to have prolonged engagement? Like she sort of suggests that, there are things like talking circles, participatory approaches. You just mentioned that, Larry. Melissa, you talked about, photo voice or photo books, but what advice do you have? She's sort of looking for advice on, what do I say? What do I do? What should I be doing in this space? Not an easy question, but.
Yeah, the first place my brain goes is having some conversations about like what makes me the best person to be giving you advice about this. Like I'm thinking about this person in particular, asking the community what makes me best situated to provide you advice about this. Is it because you are expected to produce something that's in line with methods that I have expertise in? Or is it being taken for granted that these methods are going to be the best? These methods that I maybe have some grounding or expertise in are going to be the best for this evaluation. Has that been pushed at all? Are there alternative ways of exploring different methods that are more community and culturally grounded, that I don't have expertise in, but that as a community, you may be better situated to be able to generate ideas for? So having some of those potentially awkward conversations, I think is really important off the get-go, rather than jumping to giving advice, unless they really do need advice in areas that you have expertise in, which may not necessarily be the culturally grounded, or like the examples of talking circles and that kind of thing. So that's my first thought.
I guess I might have missed it. Is this person being asked by the Indigenous community?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So they're approaching her to support around, building an evaluation plan that's, often expected as a part of a funding application.
Mhm. So I guess one of the things I would suggest is the funding for a program that's a priority in the community, or is it a program that's going to be funded and come into community, but the community hasn't really had any input into whether this program is a priority? If it is a priority, then what I would suggest is that it supports what Melissa said, is that this is an opportunity to be creative, and I'm going to be your social interpreter. So let's look at this in a way that you can transmit what you're trying to do in ways that are respectful to you and reflect what you're really trying to do. So that may be, and I'll use roots and relations again. One of the other things we've tried to do to decolonize the journal is we're telling people, as long as it's related to evaluation, it can be reading, it can be artwork, it can be stories, it doesn't have to be APA formatted. If you're submitting things in a certain way that best reflects the way that story should be told, we want it in the journal. So we've had poems, we've had poetry, poems, videos, and regular articles as well. So I'd say to the community, let's talk about, I have expertise in these kinds of things, but you're the experts in your own reality. So how can we get that across in a way that honors you and your community and those stories? And quite frankly, if the funder isn't willing to fund something like that, then you probably don't really want to work with that funder, because at some point they have to start understanding that communities need their own voice in these programs. And so.
Well, she is thankful for your response, Larry and Melissa. So that's wonderful. I am curious. I think it's fantastic advice. I think often, seasoned evaluators are being approached to work in these spaces. And we've also got new and emerging evaluators that really don't, or don't know where to turn, or don't feel as though they have the expertise in this space. But I don't think I don't think the option is just to say, I don't work in this space, right? And step away. And my question is, what advice would you have, right? If you are a seasoned evaluator and getting requests from Indigenous communities or organizations, or, starting to have that conversation on what does it mean around decolonizing methodologies and practices, or even our junior colleagues that are, still in their programs, taking courses and sort of thinking about these concepts. Like, what would be, that's a very big open question because you can give all kinds of advice, but, are there go-to places that you would suggest around readings or individuals? Is there any advice that you would have for the seasoned evaluator and the new and emerging? It might be the exact same advice.
From my perspective, well, you've put together sort of a resource list that you're sharing, right? So that's a starting point, and that'll snowball to other things. I've always said that an evaluator's toolbox is limited by their imagination. And so whether you're a seasoned evaluator or you're an emerging evaluator, I think evaluation is a wonderful chance to be creative. And you can be creative in a way that gives people who don't usually have a voice in evaluation meaningful voices. And so I guess, think outside the toolkit in terms of if you're in a community, I'll tell you, I'll give an example. We were working in a museum many years ago, and what we did is we went in and we took pictures of all the exhibits, and then we cut pictures down, and so that each type of exhibit was reflected. But we also knew some of the people that we're trying to get input from had literacy challenges. So what we did is we took these pictures, we put a number on the back, and when people were coming out of the museum, we asked them to sort these pictures into stuff they really liked to see and would like more of, stuff they could take or leave, and stuff they just didn't want to see any more of. And they did that, and we asked, where we could see, were they there by themselves? And then we asked them if they came from a particular place, province, or whatever, territory. But then when they left, because the pictures were numbered, we had sheets made where we could circle the ones that were the favorites of people, right? And so that gave us a really nice way to see what people really wanted to see more of. And we had them explain when they said, we asked them, so why do you want to see more of these kind? And they'd tell us. And why do you want to see less of those kind? And they'd tell us. So it was a really nice way to get around literacy challenges, make it sort of fun for the people. So I was showing this in New Brunswick and or Nova Scotia, I can't remember. And the person said, "This is great because we want to basically refurbish our personal care homes, but a lot of people in the personal care homes have communication problems. So what we're going to do is take pictures of different parts of the home and use that to ask people, where do you feel most comfortable here? And why, where do you feel least comfortable? And then they could use that to give them information about how to improve the homes for the residents. So, I mean, that's just one example. We've done, we've had grade 3 students draw what they saw mathematics look like. And because we were trying to figure out if in fact teachers had been given professional development on use of manipulatives, and we wanted to see if in fact the students saw manipulatives as part of mathematics. So like there's a lot of things that people can do that give voice to people who don't usually have voice in evaluation. And so that goes with Indigenous communities where, it could be over potluck, or it could be in a feast, whatever. There's a lot of different opportunities. You just have to be, I think, creative in the way you think. I'm sorry I go on too long. Melissa.
No, not at all. That was really helpful, I think. And so I think now that I was kind of immersed in listening, I've forgotten the original question, Rebecca, but I think it was around advice for emerging or seasoned evaluators. And I also saw the question in the chat about a more granular question around struggling as a literacy skills program developer, which is kind of related. Advice that if I could go back and give myself advice when I was starting out as an evaluator, I think it would be a lot of the kind of the themes that have run through what we've talked about already. It being open to learning, having patience. I heard a metaphor this morning about someone who was facilitating a conversation and how she described herself as a gardener. So, and I sort of see that metaphor as translating to evaluators, like allowing communities to access the wisdom and strengths that they already have, but evaluators taking that journey along with them, being sort of gardeners, pruning that knowledge, maybe providing momentum and synthesizing some of that knowledge. So seeing myself as a learner, I think, has been alongside people who are asking for evaluation has been really important. And just to kind of hone in on the question around a literacy skills program, not in the context of evaluation, but I have heard Dwayne Donald, who's a scholar, an Indigenous scholar here at the U of A in the Faculty of Education, talk about this idea of cultural change versus structural change. And so the question was around decolonizing a literacy skill program or individual skills assessment. And I see the distinction between cultural change and structural change being really relevant there, where, for example, in a classroom, we can make some headway in terms of cultural change. Maybe teachers emphasizing certain strengths or being creative in the way that they are assessing students. But at the same time, they may be really constrained, and a given program in a school might be really constrained by the structural elements that limit how far that goes, or just how creative we can be. And even the notion of assessing literacy skills, for example, we're constrained by the structures within which these programs and these concepts exist, even if on more granular or incremental levels we can make some headway. So I see that as being relevant too. Maybe I'm getting too philosophical there, but yeah.
I think Melissa made a really important point, is that as evaluators, we are learners. The people we deal with, they're the experts in their own reality. And so, I mean, I've never really had a project where I haven't come away having learned something, right? So it's important, I think, to understand as evaluators, we are the learners, and that the people that we talk to or deal with, they're the people who know the realities they're dealing with, and they're the experts, and we're there to make sure that their voices get heard, you know.
Thank you. That's fantastic advice. You might be getting emails about more advice seeking. We have a question around evaluation capacity building specifically, because we know that that is very much baked in often into the evaluative process, right? Where we are trying to not only build our own skills as evaluators, but build the skills and capacities of organizations and individuals that we're collaborating with. And this question is specifically around where we're working on developing evaluation frameworks that we know will involve largely Indigenous youth as participants, given the program and who serves it. We've used some different ways to try and build non-Indigenous people's capacity to offer culturally safe, culturally driven, and community-based evaluations with Indigenous groups. But I'm wondering if you have any thoughts or advice on how to approach it. So it really is, you know, kind of more global capacity building on, you know, organizations that are going to be supporting Indigenous youth in this work. And perhaps even within the program itself, you know, how do you perhaps engage the Indigenous youth themselves as co-evaluators in this process?
Yeah, it makes me think of some advice that I was given recently about a new course that I'm developing. And the advice was to try not to do everything, but to know your gifts and to stick to what your gifts are. And I see that as relevant to this question, because I see part of what happens when we involve especially youth and youth who may have faced structural forms of marginalization, like Indigenous youth, in evaluations. Part of what we're doing is helping them recognize and access and build on their strengths, which can look different for different youth who are involved. And that's how I would approach building the capacity of other people to work with youth, I think is a focus on that, and trying to figure out ways to align with the wisdom that these young people already have. Because I think when we're using the language of capacity building, sometimes we're focused on areas that are lacking, and how do we build up those areas that are lacking and build the capacity of people to do things that they may not have done before. But also we can have a balance between building up what's lacking and also building up what's already there. So helping them to access those strengths and the wisdom that they already have as youth.
I think regardless of whether it's youth or adults, you have to find forget the word, but it's sort of like a hook. And I'll use an example. Linda, who's my life partner and work partner, when we were looking at the youth gang prevention program, there was a community-based one, which basically was Indigenous youth, and it was a circle of courage. And she had to engage the youth in the evaluation. And so she thought about it, and we have a couple of dogs that we show. So what she did is one of our male dogs' name was Kevin. The day she went to meet some of the youth, she took Kevin, and she, I guess, sat there with Kevin and was patting him, and then one of the youth members came up and asked what his name was, and tell him you have to get him to do something to get a biscuit. You don't get anything for nothing. And by the end of the hour, all the youth participants were there around her and Kevin. And having made that connection, the next time she went back, she didn't have to bring Kevin, but they had the connection with her and with Kevin. So a quick, short little bit of that story is that at the end of the program for Christmas, they brought the elders, the youth, caregivers for a Christmas celebration feast. And when we were walking out, one of the youth came up to her and said, "Next time you come, why don't you bring Kevin and leave him at home?" Pointed at me. So she made a really good connection with Kevin. But it's important, regardless whether it's youth or adults, or if you have to find that connection. And if you can make that connection, then things become much easier for involvement and for doing meaningful interactions.
Thank you so much, Larry and Melissa. We are getting shy on time. I know people probably just had their lunch hour. And I think you wrap that up nicely, Larry, with really talking about connection, right? And Melissa, I know in your presentation, you talked a lot about relationality and sort of that notion of if you enter this in, from a connection perspective, from a relational perspective, going in with an open mind, an open heart, and again, you have expertise and knowledge as evaluators, but you're entering a space where others have a lot of expertise and knowledge. And how do you sort of build that relationship in that space to do good work together? So we only have a few minutes left. Lots of questions that were answered from last time, and then other ones that trickled in today. This is a continued conversation, so we want to thank you. We want to thank Larry and Melissa for joining us again to continue that conversation. You'll notice that there was a PDF put in the chat. That is a resource list that both Larry and Melissa and the ECN has compiled around some resources and different sites that you might want to go poke around to continue your learning journey. We're also really interested in hearing from you about future sessions that you might find useful, or conversations that you would continue or would like to continue to have. So we put a little link in there. I think, Nick, I believe that's your little survey link there that you've put in. So if you see that, please feel free to fill that out. And again, if you've got questions, ideas, strategies, we have a very large repository through the ECN, so we're always happy to pull together resources and make those available to the network. So if you've got things you'd like to share, please contact us at ecninfo@UAlberta, and Larry and Melissa's information is there as well. So again, thank you for joining us over your lunch hour, and we hope to see you again.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
See you in
Melissa.
Quebec.
Yeah, we'll see a couple
Yay,
people in
Nick.
Quebec.
Hey, Nick.